Good afternoon. Welcome to the Harlexton 40th Anniversary Reunion Weekend. I'm Carla Stouse. I'm a member of the Harlexton Society Board of Directors from Arcadia, Indiana, and a member of the 1976-77 Harlexton class. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. Welcome. I have the good pleasure to take my students back to Harlexton every year now, my students from Indiana University, Kokomo, and we have the good fortune to meet with Dr. Bujak on occasion there, and we are delighted to have him with us here today. Just a bit about the Harlexton Society's board and our mission, if you'll allow me a bit of time here. We like supporting Harlexton. Many of us are Harlexton graduates, members of Harlexton classes there, and we are very proud of the tradition that we were able to be a part of and still are. We are currently in the process of building an endowed scholarship fund, and we strive to support and connect Harlexton alumni. So it's a pleasure to have so many of you here already, and as the weekend goes on, we'll see so many more familiar faces. This weekend is a great example of Harlexton alumni connecting and reconnecting. So we would like to encourage you to think about supporting the Endowed Scholarship Fund. Why not buy one of those fabulous posters done by Lucy Rice? She'll be doing a signing tomorrow at 11:45 down in the Reunion headquarters. So contemplate doing that and supporting the future of Harlexton. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing a much anticipated speaker. Dr. Edward Bujak is the current Vice Principal of Academic Services at Harlexton. He joined the Harlexton faculty in 2001 as a lecturer in the British Studies program. I see many of his students here. You remember those lovely days, don't you? All those great field trips, all those wonderful lectures. He receives rave reviews from his students every year, and he was awarded UE's Outstanding Teacher in 2006. History and land ownership in England are among his specialties. He's a published author, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. This afternoon, he's going to outline for us life in the Grand Manor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bujak.
Good afternoon. Life in the Grand Manor. Following on from what was said in the previous presentation about looking at the human aspect of Harlexton Manor, it has come to my attention over the years that lectures about Harlexton inevitably focus on the manor and its architecture. And I will inevitably talk about this extraordinary building. However, what I want to do today in this lecture is consider the story of the people who've lived in it, who have owned this building, shaped the building, lived in it. Because in many respects that is the true meaning of the building itself. It's just bricks and stone without people actually in it. And we begin, as you would expect, with Gregory, whose creation this is. Gregory is, as we now have a sense of, a very enigmatic figure. There are no known full portraits of Gregory in existence. This is a roundel image that appears at the top of the cedar staircase at the heart of the manor. It's about 70 feet up, and to get this I had to overcome various vertigo issues. Nonetheless, this image is probably the only image that we have of Gregory. Now again, it's supposition, but the fact that this image is flanked by the reverse double G, his insignia, and the Gregory coat of arms, all suggests that this image of him is actually Gregory. The fact that this image is also faced by a floor plan of the manor is also indicative of the fact that this is probably Gregory himself. The genealogist James Burke wrote in 1853 that the house and gardens at Harlexton show that a plain English country gentleman of moderate fortune can erect a pile which might be envied by the greatest princes of the continent. Now, I'm an Englishman, but even I have to suggest that there's a little bit of English bias in that statement, to suggest that a plain English country gentleman was a match for any European prince. At one level, one doesn't wish to disagree with that, but there is a degree of English bias in there. Gregory, as Tim Knox has argued, was altogether something more sophisticated than a plain English country gentleman, and was clearly, as we've seen from the discussion about the gardens, intent on building a palatial compendium of some of the greatest houses in England. When you go to Harlexton, you are visiting England in itself. According to William White's Directory of Lincolnshire for 1854, he visited many of the ancient and finest mansions in England and on the continent for the purpose of maturing the plans of this unique mansion and its tasteful gardens and pleasure grounds. We do not know which mansions he visited in Europe, although we are aware that he was one of the most remarkably travelled men of his generation. We have an enigmatic quote from him which suggests that he had travelled far and wide in pursuit of ideas for his house. In pursuing ideas for this house, it has led me into all parts of the world and to mix with every variety of nation and character. And as was mentioned in the previous presentation, we have references of him in Paris and in Constantinople and in the Crimea, travelling across the Mediterranean and northern Europe. But these are only enigmatic suggestions. A grand tour across Europe that he repeated in England, with visits to Burley, Montague, Hardwick, Hatfield, Knowle, Rushton, Kirby, Longleat, Woolerton, Cobham, Hengrave and Bramshill, a veritable who's who of English country houses. Gregory was not building a plain country house, as his neighbour and close friend Christopher Turner was to do at Stoke Rochford, which is still extant, and you can go and visit it and make an excellent comparison between the two buildings. Stoke Rochford was a country mansion, and it was the model of a Jacobean country mansion, but it's nothing compared to Harlexton. Harlexton was the creation of Anthony Salvin, we are told. However, we know from the original, from much discussion, that Gregory broke with Salvin, whose watercolour we saw at the front of this presentation. And then it became William Byrne, that other great architect of the Victorian era, who went on to build the house, and to whom we assign the extensions on the far side of the house. So you see that original watercolour brought to life here with the Salvin design, although the extent to which it's Salvin or Gregory, I would argue, is a matter of discussion to be had. But what takes it to a whole nother level of property and creates a nightmarish maintenance bill is that then this huge extension goes out to the west, and then this other extension out here, and another extension out here. One historian has referred to this as an exercise in megalomania. Nonetheless, it's this vast extension of these buildings and properties and the sites, as you just keep adding on more and more and more, in addition to the grounds and the house itself. But why build this vast property? Gregory was a man well travelled. Gregory had built up one of the great private collections through his travels across Europe and the continent, and needed a venue in which to display them. And we have here a stereograph from the late 1860s showing how the state dining room would have looked in the time of Gregory. We see this remarkable fireplace at the back. Now, research recently done by Christopher Wilson of the Department of Art at University College London has identified these 12 marble eggs, here there's 12 of them, as belonging to a set of 22 that back in 1535 had been part of a choir screen at a church in Mons in Flanders that was still there in 1795, and which clearly came onto the market as a result of the chaos that ensued out of the Napoleonic Wars. And Gregory, who was travelling around Europe, we know at the post-Napoleonic War era, picked these up at auction and brought them here to set in place in his state dining room, backed onto a grand fireplace made in Aberdeenshire granite that is an exact replica of a Jacobean fireplace that he would have seen in Hatfield House. So the more you go around this house, it's a treasure trove of reference points to other properties, both internally and externally. White's Gazetteer of Lincolnshire also speaks of the tapestry gallery, with its 5 pieces of tapestry. The 2 pieces over the fireplaces, Vulcan and Bacchus, are very large. And remarkably, 5 years after that reference turns up in the Gazetteer, we have another stereograph, and we can see these vast tapestries here and here in the long gallery, as it would have been in the time of Gregory. These are the rooms that he would have seen and walked through, and is now the lecture hall, where some of you have studied, and those who. But nonetheless, it's a fantastic thing. Having moved into the manor in 1851, the restlessness of the man ensured that embellishments continued to be added, as we've seen on this vast extension of the house, right up until his death in 1854. And for such a remarkable individual, we find in the Times for 1854 one sentence only, under deaths. On Thursday, 15th last at Harleston Manor House, Lincolnshire, Gregory, Esquire. That's it. Bird records that the cause of death was gout exhaustion. In the view of Pamela Tudor Craig, now Lady Wedgwood, Harleston was his all-consuming passion. And given the effort of so many years, probably nearly a quarter of a century on this project, it probably did exhaust him. And bizarrely, as we were mentioned in the previous presentation, we don't know where this man is buried. He undertakes one of the great building projects of 19th century England, and he has no grave. Claudius Loudon in 1840 wrote that Gregory may be said to have embodied himself in the edifice, clearly referencing the fact of how much energy and effort he's pouring into the project. But this was probably his intention. The house probably is his epitaph. We know from the research of the previous presentation in 2010 that a crack team, led by Mark Valenzuela, of elite engineering students, having run out of things to do, decided to go to the archives. And in so doing, discovered Gregory's will. And in Gregory's will, we find this very poignant phrase, that my funeral was to be as plain as is consistent with my situation in life. So plain, in fact, that we have speculation as to where the grave may be. We can spot an unmarked grave next to two of his relatives in the churchyard, but we can't confirm that that actually is his grave. So indeed the house was, and is, his epitaph. Interestingly, despite being such a private, almost reclusive individual, Gigi opened his magnificent mansion to the public every Thursday, admission tickets being obtained from a Mr. Scorer at the inn at the top of the drive. But while people strolled through the grounds, behind the scenes a huge legal battle was looming for control of this property. Ultimately, Gregory had intended the whole of his estate to go to his neighbour, friend and kinsman, Sir Glyn Wilby of Denton Manor on the other side of the valley, uniting this great house with a great estate. Because one of the fundamental weaknesses of the whole Harleston property, which is why it got into so much trouble, there is no vast estate to go with it. With this in mind, Gregory wrote the following proviso into this will, that anyone succeeding to the settled estates would also enjoy his personal estate, providing that within 1 year of succeeding they agreed that in the absence of any children, the whole would go to Sir Glyn Welby and his heirs. In 1854, the settled estates went to his cousin, George Gregory, who died childless and followed the preconditions set down by Gregory, which meant that in addition to the settled estate, namely his settled properties in the Harleston estate, he would have access to his personal estate, this vast cash fortune that Gregory sat on. After George, the estate was entailed to another distant cousin, John Sherwin Gregory, who, though married, was also childless, so it would seem that there was the possibility now of the unification after John died. But John had no intention of abiding by Gregory's will, and so, after 1 year, the trustees of Gregory's will removed all assets belonging to Gregory's personal estates in the house. They went through the house and stripped it as part of the personal estate that he was no longer entitled to for not agreeing to Gregory's personal will. Why Sherwin Gregory acted in this manner is unclear. But he did so, and the house lost the collection for which it had been built, and the possibility of combining the house with the huge estate that it needed to have to make it sustainable. The house and the much smaller surrounding estate would now have to pass to an invented heir. Thomas Sherwin Pearson Gregory was neither a Gregory nor a Sherwin. He was the youngest son of General T.H. Pearson and John Sherwin Gregory's godson. And in 1892, he succeeded Mrs. Sherwin Gregory, whose portrait we saw. And there he is, there, with his kinsman and friend. According to his later obituary in the Times, in his younger days, Pearson Gregory was considered one of the finest amateur wicket-keepers in England, which, if you're English, is a true accolade, and also one of its finest shots. Indeed, Pearson Gregory was generally known at the time as the man with the gun, the quintessential English sporting gentleman who carried, quote, the pursuit of sport to a degree of perfection as great as his predecessor did that of building. He was even mentioned in the Times as a recognised authority on the problems associated with keeping game in prime fox hunting country, one of the more other tensions with the beaver estate, because the beaver estate had one of the great fox hunting traditions and he wanted to shoot things. So you've got an inherent tension there within rural society. On the Harlexton estate, according to the Times, Mr. Pearson Gregory has allowed many foxes to placate the beaver estate. And at the same time, he has as good a stock of partridges as anyone can desire. It may be added, he has a most excellent and energetic set of keepers, and always leaves a good breeding stock with plenty of margin for an occasional nest to be raided by a fox. Because in fox hunting country, you can't shoot a fox, so you have to sacrifice your partridges. Inside the manor, he lived in grand style as the quintessential English squire, with the house well furnished, even allowing for the loss of the Gregory heirlooms and collections, as you see in these remarkable slides of 1906. So this is the long gallery, still with at least one of the great tapestries, which would worth an absolute fortune. If we had one of these now, we wouldn't have to worry about the roof. So you've got the long gallery all set out, and then you see the state dining room, which is now a classroom itself as well, still set out for great dining occasions, which he was very keen on. The long gallery, the great hall set out as an English country gentleman's apartments, with apparently a portrait of Gregory over the top of what is now what was called the Minstrel's Gallery, although that's sadly been lost. And finally, the Gold Room, which again is one of the classrooms now. But again, a lot of those features would not be familiar to our students. They've been there because it all got ripped out, sadly. But it's life on the grand scale. I mean, this really is. There's a sense with Gregory that it's an empty mausoleum that's never got lived in. But there was a family in there, and they're living in grand style, and they're living the life of the English country squirearchy, and it's all going to come to a massive grinding halt. But in 1912, 2 years before the grinding halt, his heir, Philip Pearson Gregory of the Grenadier Guards, married Marcia Ridley, and the Times records a number of NCOs of the Grenadier Guards lined the aisle during the ceremony. Lieutenant Pearson Gregory then resigned his commission in 1913, no doubt with a view to settling down in the English countryside with his new wife. 12 months later, you have the outbreak of the First World War. He automatically rejoins his regiment in the Grenadier Guards and was sent to France. With the outbreak of the First World War, stately homes across Britain were placed at the disposal of the country by their owners as part of the war effort. Harlexton's contribution to the war effort was immense. Behind the Victorian terraces that we've seen, behind the fountains laid out by Gregory, behind those 7 terraces, you have flat land, and you have a lovely draught of air coming up those terraces, which makes it an ideal place to put an airdrome. In 1916, the recently formed Royal Flying Corps, the predecessor to today's Royal Air Force, set up RAF Harlexton for a training squadron, number 44 Reserve Training Squadron, and you can just pick out from this aerial photo one of their aircraft coming into land by the shadow on the fields. To get your bearings, that's the tree line at the top of the terraces, and the house is on the other side of that slope, sloping down into the valley. So this remarkable photograph from 1917 shows the wooden hangars and the hutted accommodation of the aerodrome. The first squadron to be there was number 44 Reserve Squadron, flying the Avro 504, so you'd have seen those flying over the top of the Manor House. And there is a very high likelihood, given Pearson Gregory's love of entertainment, that the flying officers of the squadrons training at Harleston prior to being posted to France, where their life expectancy was almost nil, would indeed have been entertained in that state dining room. Meanwhile, in the grounds itself, the British Army was making use of Harleston Park. In 1915, the 11th Infantry Division was stationed in the grounds of Harleston Park and Belton Park. The division was raised from amongst the hundreds of thousands of volunteers who'd responded to Lord Kitchener's call, "Your country needs you." So this is one of the new divisions being raised as part of the new army that would go into combat in 1916 on the Somme. However, the 11th was trained at a more accelerated rate. What we see here is a slide from Belton Park showing the cantonments of 11th Infantry Division, and that's what the grounds at Harleston would have looked like as well before the division shut down. Because in June 1915, very quickly into its training rota, and probably a little bit too early in its training rota, the 11th Infantry Division was shipped out of Belton Park and Harleston Manor and shipped out to Gallipoli. According to James Murden's invaluable history, when time came for the division to move to Gallipoli, it took a whole day for the troops to march past the village. The campaign at Gallipoli was very simply an attempt to try and break the stalemate on the Western Front. And the idea was to take out Turkey, which had joined the Central Alliance, by landing troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, to force open the Dardanelles Straits, resupply Russia, and re-energise Russia's war effort, and open a new Eastern Front. Unfortunately, the strategy may make sense. The execution of the Gallipoli campaign was one of the great disasters of World War I, and the 11th Division, which was stationed at Harleston, was right in the heart of it. And here we see, again, a remarkable slide of the 11th being landed on the beaches at Silver Bay on the Dardanelles Peninsula, with the Royal Navy battleships out there giving coverage. They never got off the beachheads. They landed on the beaches, they stayed on the beaches for several weeks and sustained horrendous casualties from Turkish artillery, machine gun fire, and the inevitable disease that accommodated all the casualties on those beaches. And the division was eventually withdrawn in December. Meanwhile, back at Harleston, the park that had been home to the 11th Infantry Division had become home to the newly raised Machine Gun Corps. The bitter experiences of fighting on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915 had convinced the British Army of the need to increase the firepower of British infantry divisions by creating specialist machine gun companies attached to each infantry brigade. To this end, a machine gun training centre was established at Grantham, at Belton Park. However, recent research by the Machine Gun Corps History Project, which are doing some fantastic work, has uncovered photographs of the machine gunners being trained in Harleston Manor's Park as well. The 1917 Machine Gun Corps Instruction Manual has this photo of Harleston Park. And if you can just make out, there's trenches here and here, and there's a trench line here, and there's one chap there with a Vickers heavy machine gun, and there's one chap there with a Lewis machine gun, practicing the art of machine gun training in these improvised foxholes with these dummy Vickers heavy machine guns, learning the tactics that would play such a vital role in holding the trench lines for real on the Western Front throughout 1916, 17 and 18. The machine gunners, because of the vital role they play in the defences of the Western Front, were the ones that the German snipers targeted first in any assault, so the Machine Gun Corps nicknamed themselves the Suicide Club. A rather grim bit of humour. James Murden, invaluable history, also suggests that Harleston had a trench warfare school attached to this machine gunners' school as well. Subsequent research, again by the Machine Gun Corps History Project, indicates that Harleston was potentially the site of a massive trench warfare training school for officers. The sheer size of this potential trench warfare area is revealed by this slide of the plan. And what we've got Harleston Park. I'll show an aerial photo of this to orientate yourself accordingly. But essentially what they're planning on building is a replica of the German trench lines in France, three-echelon trench line over here, with no man's land in between, and then with the British trench lines over here, to practice the art of attacking or defending trench lines with the various fields of fire that you would need to apply to defend the trench line throughout an attack. To orientate yourself for that, what you have here is that they've overlain that map with an aerial photograph. So we've got the houses here, again there's the woods on that inclining slope, the amphitheatre of the house, here. And you've got, the mile drive would be about here. There's the walled gardens, there's the lake, and you can see they're stretching out this trench warfare school training area all the way across those fields there. Now, thinking about that, it's hard to imagine that when you walk through the grounds of the manor today, and out through the Southern Gatehouse, past the Victorian walled garden, and out to the front gates for a quiet pint at the Gregory, that when you're actually walking along that mile drive, you're walking along an area where officers once trained in the art of survival in the trenches in Flanders. It is even harder to imagine how this would have felt if you consider the story of Philip Pearson Gregory. The last time I mentioned him, he was a young lieutenant who was rejoining his regiment on the outbreak of war and went to France. The thing about the Grenadier Guards is that it's one of the crack regiments of the British Army, so they're going to go in first in any combat on the Western Front. He was in the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, which is the crack battalion of this crack regiment. He fights throughout the entire First World War, going from lieutenant to captain to major to, at one time, acting commanding officer of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards. A position he held because in 1917 the unit was one of the first units that went in at the Third Battle of Ypres or Passchendaele on 16th July at 3:35 a.m, going over the top. Within seconds, several men of the regiment have been killed, the colonel has been killed, and he takes the command of the regiment and continues to take the objective set. For that action, he would then go on to win the Military Cross, which is the second highest award that we can offer below the Victoria Cross. How he would have felt, having gone through the experiences on the Western Front, and then he comes home on leave to Harleston to be confronted by a trench warfare training school with a machine gun training school as well, kind of boggles belief, really, how you would adapt to that. You come home to get away from it and you look out of your windows and there's trench lines and people using dummy machine guns out there. One of the chaps I'm going to do more research on. The war, however, finally ends. With the end of the war, the trench warfare training schools, machine gun training pits are filled in. The Royal Flying Corps Harleston Station is converted back to farmland. These fields are converted back to farmland. Everything was as it once was. Life in the manor returned to something like normality. PG, as he was affectionately known, was still the squire, and guests once more became accustomed to the quaint lack of electricity and of plumbing in the manor. On an unrelated line of research, I recently received a letter from Gillian Bent-Jones of Orwell Park House in Suffolk, and it transpired that her great-uncle was Philip Pearson Gregory, Marcia, his wife, being her great-aunt. In a rather poignant letter, she recalled, "My mother, as a child, spent every Christmas of her life at Harleston and loved it, though her parents sometimes found it a bit austere, as there was no electricity." This was because Pearson Gregory was today what we would call old school. Back then, they would say he was a lover of the old order. As a result, modern devices never found their way into Harleston if he could help it. He only broke the house rule once in 1935, when the Grantham Journal reported that, throwing open his mansion in support of the Grantham Hospital, he gave permission for electric light to be installed for one night only. The whole of the apparatus was removed the very next day, and to the present time his lovely residence has been lighted by oil lamps and candles. as we can see from this slide here. What you've actually got there, whereas now you have a huge crystal chandelier, you actually now, in this slide, you have these oil lamps and candles, which for those of us who've been there at night would have added a truly Gothic aspect to the house with the lighting. It would have been fabulous. Interestingly, according to Molly Thornton, the head housemaid in the 1930s, she's the one who suggests that this actually is Gregory watching over all by these candlelights. Unfortunately, this painting was removed when the contents of the house was sold in 1937. The absence of electric light in a house as large as this made staying as a guest at the manor an unusual experience. According to Catherine Thomason, when I was the only guest, a housemaid was installed in a guest chamber adjoining mine in case I felt nervous, sleeping several minutes' walk from any other inhabited rooms. In the days of the early Gregorys, footmen accompanied all guests to their quarters for fear they would get lost. It was probably less alarming if one actually lived in the manor. For example, with Philip Pearson Gregory and his wife Marcia and their four children, 3 girls and a boy, actually in residence, the house finally had what it had never had, a family in residence. Again, quoting from the invaluable letter of Gillian Pence-Jones. In Marcia's time, I gather the house was a happy, lively place, as she was good with the servants and said, in winter, I'd just get a small sitting room really warm. The bedrooms, bathrooms and dining room fairly warm, and practically run through the passages, which is something generations of students are now familiar with when they have to take showers at the manor and are confronted by the passageways back to their rooms. Cook gets the kitchens and servants' hall really hot, but heaven help the maids in those bedrooms. At least I make sure they've got lots of blankets. According to Violet Parker, a scullery maid at the manor in 1931, the staff then consisted of a butler, a footman, a hall boy, and a valet, 3 housemaids in need of blankets, the scullery maid, 2 laundry maids, a cook, and a housekeeper. So it's the perfect functioning English country house, the kind of setting for P.G. Wodehouse or Evelyn Waugh. Whenever you read those books, that's what it was. Sadly, in 1930, Marcia was killed in a car crash, and apparently Philip never smiled again and was lost without her, and the servants mostly left. So we see the beginning of a collapse at the house. In 1935, Thomas Pearson Gregory died at 84, having left a year's wages to all his staff on his death. Within 2 years, 1937, that manor house, its contents, the surrounding estate, were all put up for sale by Philip Pearson Gregory, ending the Gregory family's association and name associated with the manor. But we are now into an era, in the late 1920s, 1930s, when houses such as Harleston were being demolished. With the house on the market, Arthur Oswald, writing in Country Life, makes perhaps one of the great understatements when he observed, Harleston is a tour de force. It is a landmark in 19th century architecture, and for that reason, if for no other, its destruction would be regrettable. However, in 1937, the manor, its contents and the estate were put up for sale in separate lots and dispersed. And once a country house, and this is the key point, became detached from its surrounding estate, the likelihood of demolition increased. Because in general terms, it was the estates that covered the running costs of the houses. Houses could be built out of personal fortunes. Houses could be sustained out of personal fortunes. But it was the estates surrounding it that provided the economic continuity for maintaining them. Divorce a great house like this and its running costs from estates and farm rents, and they're white elephants, and they will be demolished. They're just so much redundant building material for which you can make a good sum. So houses were increasingly being demolished in the 1920s. Private income could only be used for so long to sustain these things. So you needed to find a benefactor with very, very deep pockets. The question was in 1937, where was this benefactor to be found? The Grantham Journal reported that the manor and the park was bought in 1937 by Mr. E. Marshall, who at 84 years of age was the oldest surviving tenant of the old squire, Pearson Gregory. and purchased the manor and the park for, quote, sentimental reasons. But the estate had been broken up, as the days of the sporting Edwardian squirearchy were over, and without an estate, the house risked becoming a white elephant. And like many country house owners in the 1920s and 1930s, sentiment could not overcome basic economics. Hence the rise in demolitions, a fact Mr. Marshall was forced to accede when he told the Grantham Journal, having purchased the manor, having purchased the park, having sold the timber in the park, so I don't think it was totally sentiment that was driving him, having now done all that, if he now failed to find a purchaser for the manor, it would be demolished. It was shortly thereafter that one of the more remarkable women of the 20th century, Violet van der Elst, purchased the manor, saving it from demolition. And for this action, in the opinion of Henry Thorold, a local historian, she should be canonised. Violet van der Elst was a self-made millionaire who proudly stated, "I have made 3 fortunes and lost 5. She was an unashamed eccentric and major social campaigner, campaigning against the death penalty and various other social reform issues in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's a great book going to come out on it recently from one of the university professors in London shortly. She also had a fascination for the occult, with collecting one of the finest occult collections in the country. She purchased the manor for £78,000, which in 1937 prices was a vast sum. She renamed it Grantham Castle, and then proceeded to spend a further £250,000, and this is in the 1930s, on modernising and refurbishing the manor. As we see in this slide of the long gallery, the first thing she added was electricity. Hence these, and also that great chandelier which was destined to the bank in Madrid, but the Spanish Civil War got in the way, so she bought it instead and put it in there. And a rather fine improvement it is too on the candlelight. She also purchased the bronze lions on the gate piers in the front circle and the marble lions, the Harloxton lions on the lion terrace from Whitley Court. And despite many efforts by Whitley Court to have them back, they're not having them back. Oh no, there are lions now. Although you should read some of the letters they've sent in the archives, it's quite remarkable, cheeky souls. Anyway, so she's got this great house, which is no longer Harloxton Manor, it's Grantham Castle. And the thing about it is, with regards to the breakup of the Gregory collection, which is taken as a given by many historical sources, the fact remains there was a tremendous amount of this collection still left when Pearson Gregory's walking around and tripping over stuff. And lo and behold, there's this vast collection of statuary that she converts the Great Hall into this statuary gallery. Now, either she's going around London making a fortune with all this stuff in storage somewhere, or this is still part of the Gregory collection that's just never got shifted. Because this is looking at one direction, and what's really interesting, if you pay a close look, she's put a mirror in here, so you double the effect of the length of the Great Hall, which is a great use of the mirrors. And then you look from the other direction, and again, you have this wonderful statuary gallery, very reminiscent of what you see in Chatsworth. And if you want to get a sense of Chatsworth, Pride and Prejudice, when Keira Knightley is walking around thinking, "Oh yes, I think I rather will marry Mr. Darcy." That's the marble gallery of Chatsworth. And that's essentially what you've got here, this fantastic marble gallery. I mean, some of these Louis XIV tables, unbelievable value of this stuff. So, what we have then is Violet van der Elst building, effectively, as is described, a castle in the air. And quite remarkably, hence this rather blank slide, which will hopefully work, touch wood, we have, from 1939, a clip from Pathé News, going around Harloxton Manor with a news camera and seeing what it said. "I apologise for the 1939 English accent, we don't talk like that no more." But despite all this grandeur and living in such splendid circumstances with a brand new Chippendale table and everything there, she tended to eat by herself in a corner surrounded by her dogs. Meanwhile, her researches through books of alchemy for the elixir of life proved fruitless, and she told the Picture Post in 1939, "These elixirs were only myths. The only true elixir that I know of in this world to keep one young is happiness and a contented mind." Good for her. And whatever contentment she may have found at Harleston was now ending, because on the day after her interview in the Picture Post was published, 2nd September 1939, Britons turned on their radios to hear the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, announce that Britain was now once more at war with Germany. Across Britain, country houses were now, this time showing the changing position of the aristocracy in British society, were no longer offered up to the state for help in the war. They were now requisitioned by the state for helping in the war effort. Harleston was once more in the front line. RAF Harleston was reactivated in World War II, operating as a relief landing ground from 1942 to 1945, and Andrew Layer has done a wonderful job of getting the map of that all set out, which I will be using and exploiting this summer. Excellent, good for him. So the thought of injured aircraft flying in over over Harleston as this reserve landing ground is quite a terrifying thought. On one occasion, a Lancaster bomber, the big 4-engine chaps, came in and landed on the back of the Manor, so it would have been a quite remarkable bit of flying. Meanwhile, the Manor itself, like say many country houses, became home to another new generation of soldiers. By 1944, Harleston, together with all the other country houses around Grantham, was the dispersal area for the 1st Airborne Division. In early 1944, in the weeks preceding D-Day, when the division was inspected by King George V, the 6th, and we can place that here. There's the walled garden there. See that it's in the fields directly opposite the walled garden. The Manor was home to 253 Light Composite Company Royal Army Service Corps. Their job was to fly on the Dakotas at almost treetop level and push out those canisters to resupply the troops who'd already landed. So their casualty figures were quite appalling. On the King's left is Lieutenant Colonel Pack, Commanding Officer 253 Light Company, and the area behind him here is blanked out to cover up the Commanding Officer, 1st Airborne Division, Major General Roy Urquhart. In mid-1944, after D-Day, the division was still being held at reserve, and other elements of the division were rotated through the Manor, including the 1st Forward Airborne Observation Unit Royal Artillery, which we can see in this remarkable survival from the war. We've often wondered what F-O-U-R-A meant. Well, from referencing to the divisional diary, Forward Observation Unit Royal Artillery, although he was obviously a Fusilier as well, with the Fusilier badge behind him, coming in on a wing. And we can date this then to somewhere between June 1944 and September 1944. And the fact that in the 1970s some of our earlier students decided to get some crayon and put a rather nice pink and green effect going, whilst at one level a bit concerning, is actually much to be lauded because that's preserved it, because it created a waterproof cover for it. However, this is to be found over the top of the refectory. Interestingly, there's other insignia there which suggests that the division had a longer association with the Manor. Because when you look at the early insignia, you find here, when the division was first formed in 1942, the parachute was on a shield with a crown above it, which you don't see on the later insignia, but just the wings and the parachute. So this is one of the earliest versions of the insignia. We also have, just to the right of this, I'm going to go and check on that, 27th of January 1942, here. So on 27th of January 1942, was in here dawdling on the wall with the initial insignia of the division. 1st Airborne Division was formed in late 1941, so there's elements of the division at Harleston, not in 1944, they're already there in 1942, which is when the division was actually being formed. So there's more research to be done here, but essentially you can argue that Harleston was in at the absolute beginning of the 1st Airborne Division itself. By 1944, however, we know that the division is being ready for action in Europe. It's held in reserve after D-Day, but it's primed, it's ready to go. And here we see a fantastic photo of Colonel John Killick, who was commander of 89 Parachute Field Security Section Intelligence Corps. Basically, we see him standing in the front circle with the steps going up to the to make that next level there. So you've got the front gates here, and that's where he stood. Killick's group, 89 Parachute Field Security Corps Company, their job was to go in ahead of the division and capture any high-ranking German officers and interrogate them to get a sense of the dispositions of any German forces that they might encounter. According to Killick, at this time, in late 1944, the unit that was then rotated through the Manor was the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Airborne Division, and that's really quite significant, because in September 1944, the division is deployed as part of Market Garden, the big assault by Britain to get the British 21st Army Group to end the war before Christmas. They're still trying to end the war before Christmas. Basically, what you were going to have, what happened was, the American 101st took the bridges here, the American 82nd Airborne took the bridges here around Nijmegen, and then the 1st Airborne Division was to take the bridge at Arnhem over the Rhine. 30 Corps was to punch up this road, smash over the bridge at Arnhem into the German world, and end the war by Christmas. This particular battle, the Battle of Arnhem, is known as a bridge too far, because, unfortunately, the drop zone took them to the west of the city when they should have been to the east of the city, and between them and the bridgehead was set Beatrix SS Panzer Division, which nobody had noticed, which is a bit unfortunate. Out of the whole division, the only unit that actually got to the north end of the bridge was Frost's 2nd Battalion, which, if we believe Killick, was the unit that was actually based at Harleston. They're the only unit that got to the end of the bridge, where they held out for 3 days. The word heroic is bandied about far too liberally these days. That, however, was a truly heroic action. That battalion held out against an SS Panzer Division for 3 days armed with Tiger tanks. They were annihilated because no relief force ever came. Pretty much the whole division was wiped out at Arnhem, which is why, that's the bridge itself, you can get a sense of the structure. I mean, it was just absolute carnage. But the guys who came back built that memorial, which is why it's so significant point. It's the only extant memorial to the 1st Airborne Division that we know of in the United Kingdom. And it was built apparently by surviving members of the Provost Company, who were housed at the Manor throughout late 1944, 1945, and is, according to the archives, the work of Lance Corporals Tyler and Lance Corporal Hinchcliffe. And that is why we have the Pegasus Courtyard to the 1st Division at Harleston. After the war, I do apologise. After the war, the house returned to the sole occupancy of its owner, Violet van der Elst, who was none too happy because part of Killick's training exercise with the Field Security Corps was blowing up the trees in the grounds with plastic explosive to get some practice in. So having seen her trees blown up and the grounds carved up, she decided to sell. In 1948, the house was turned into a seminary. According to Christopher Hussey, writing in Country Life, parts of the house have been adapted or reconstructed and now admirably serve its present use. For those of us, I could go into great length about this, but essentially you will go around the manor and anything with a bit of concrete on it, you can pretty much guess was the Jesuits. They had a great habit of recreating mullioned windows, which if you look at the old part of the house with stone, and they've recreated that with concrete to punch holes through everywhere. So a lot of what we think is original is actually remodelling by the Jesuits. How unfortunately the Jesuits won't let us into their archive, being Jesuits, and so consequently, being a secretive bunch, we don't know which bits they knocked through. But you can take educated guesses which paint has a Jesuit sledgehammer on it. So that's another project for an engineering professor at some point. What we do know is that they remodelled most of the house. The long gap, the Great Hall, the Ridgeway Great Hall as it's called, was remodeled to become a chapel, and in so doing they boarded up the main entrance into the cedar staircase. There is a secret passageway behind there which we've recently discovered, and that might accidentally get jimmied and opened. But that would be a pure accident because that would spoil the part of the woodwork. We wouldn't want that. But that's all there. And of course there's still some bits, but there is the most appalling light fixtures in there. Not to pay attention to the detail, but there was once great chandeliers, and now they have these awful light fixtures. Thus it was with these appalling light fixtures in situ that when the Jesuits finally left, Stanford came in to lease the manor and to then create one of the first study abroad programs in Britain, in Europe, for American students. And then in 1971, the lease was taken over by the University of Evansville. Subsequently, the great Bill Ridgway bought the manor and presented it to the University of Evansville. The university's mission is perhaps best summed up in an interview given by Jeremy Rusk in the Nottingham Journal in 1972, in which he argued, alongside various other lines, that the peculiar typical British coolness is a myth. No, it's not. We are particularly cool. However, on the other paragraph is a fantastic line that jumps right out at you when you read, and we're not warm, open-hearted either. We're cold and cynical. Except when you dump tea in a river. That's another story. By the way, I don't know what that British breakfast tea is in the Ridgway thing, but it's not tea. I was mightily deceived. However, in reading this wonderful, wonderful piece of information, 1972, talking about the warm-hearted British, we're not all cold fish, we actually do have a heart, you find a fantastic phrase. The opening of what was then the Harloxton Study Centre. The opening of the Harloxton Study Centre is really a moral obligation for the people of the 20th century to transcend nationalism and find out what it is like to live in the other world. And I personally don't think you can find a better evocation of the value of Harloxton College than that from 1972 from Jeremy Rusk. It is a moral obligation. And to follow that up, I would like to now show a clip from 1975. Do allow for a 5-minute overrun. I do apologise. I should have been finished at 4:40. But this is very good. It's 6 minutes, but it's from 1975, 4 years after the original, after Harloxton opened it, with the original professor running it. Some things never change. Still complaining about the heating. That was from 4 years in 1975, and we're now celebrating the next 35 years. So this program's been going 40 years now. And what was then true in 1975, I would argue, is still perfectly true now in 2011, that the goal is to create, as they say, citizens of the world. And it is valid now, and it was valid then, to enable students to develop an awareness of themselves and the world. And today we celebrate 40 years of the University of Evansville's mission at Harloxton College. Today the Manor is home, as we speak, to 178 Americans, living for 4 months far from home in this other world as citizens of the world. But in so doing, and here's the really amazing piece for me when you think back to where we started this presentation with regard to Gregory, there they are, and their pursuit leads me into all parts of the world and to mix with every variety of nation and character. And they have been doing exactly that for the last 40 years, and long may it continue. Thank you very much.